Okay, hello everybody. I hope everybody's having a fun time at Drupal GovCon. This presentation is going to be about getting a Drupal certification, specifically a general Drupal certification, so without any sort of specialty. A bit about me. My name is Joseph Pond. I'm a backend developer at Bixel. I've been working with PHP for about 8 years. I've been working with Drupal specifically for about 5 years. I first came to Drupal when I came to Bixel, and I've been with them for about 5 years. I currently work remotely for them in Richmond, Virginia. Bix was actually the ones that pushed for me to get the certification, they kind of brought it up to me, and I thought it was a great idea. So I went ahead and did it. It's a great company to work for, FYI. So getting certified, how and why would you want to do that? Here's just a little bit of the agenda, and at the end, I'll go ahead and have a Q&A if anybody has any questions. So why get certified? So getting certified helps prove your knowledge. It validates your skills. It provides a sort of proof of competency. So you can say that I really do know what I'm talking about. It makes a good impression on clients. So that if you're talking to clients, you can show them that you really are familiar with Drupal, or you have at least a base understanding of it. If you're on a job hunt, it can help you do that, especially, for example, if you're a full stack developer and you really don't have much experience with Drupal in your resume and you're looking for a Drupal job, then maybe a Drupal certification can help you kind of get a leg up in getting that job. Also, for me, it was nice to just prove it to myself that this thing that I've been working on and that I've been learning, I really do know the right things about it. I know how to use it. I'm not just some person hacking away at it. That was a big part of it for me. Also, going to improve yourself professionally. You'll learn more about Drupal. For example, I'm a backend developer, so I'm pretty familiar with the backend, but the front end I'm not so familiar with. There's a lot of parts of it that I don't handle, or I handle not as often. And just from studying the different sections for the exam, it actually helped me out with that a lot. I learned a lot of things that I didn't already know. So it'll help you kind of find things, ways to do things that maybe you're doing, but in a better way. And for some other things, you'll get validation that the way you're doing it is right, because sometimes I feel like I'm doing something, I'm like, is this the right way? Is this the best practice? And having it on the exam kind of really helps, solidify that and take away that worry in your mind, or at least it did for me. So a bit about the certification. The certification is by Acquia. It's the Acquia Certified Drupal Developer. It's available for Drupal 7, Drupal 8, and Drupal 9. There's a 90-minute time limit. It's 60 multiple choice questions total. Some of those questions, they'll be like select all or all that apply and stuff like that. So it's not all just select one. So you don't just have, that 25% chance to get any question. It is a pass-fail exam. You get 65% to pass. Otherwise, you don't pass, unfortunately. I took it during kind of like close to peak pandemic. So the only option for me was virtual. I don't know what the current options are with everything that's going on, but virtual is totally possible. It's really easy to do. You just set up an appointment, make sure that you have a quiet space. I rented a room in the library, which worked out really well for me, so I didn't have to worry about any sort of distractions or anything like that. And the nice thing is it is an instant result. So if you're like familiar with an AWS certification or something where sometimes it might come back, a few days later, with this, you get to know immediately, which is nice. It takes a lot of stress off of waiting to figure out if you actually passed it. So for me getting certified, when I went to do it, I was about I had 3 years of Drupal experience under my belt before taking the certification. So that helped me get a good base understanding of Drupal. And then I had studying on top of that. So if you're looking at my path, maybe keep that in mind. Maybe you only have 1 year, or if you're a full stack developer and you haven't used Drupal as much, maybe you want to spend more time on it than I did. Because there are parts that can be difficult, some parts a little easier. And I'll go through other different sections so you can see uh, how they might relate to you and where you might find your strengths and weaknesses. So I studied for about a week for the exam, and really that just meant going through specific documentation and making sure that I had not just an understanding of how things worked, but that I really kind of dug in and knew naming conventions, and I didn't have to Google it, because I find in my normal workflow, like if I'm trying to create a new module, I don't really do it off the top of my head. Like the info.yaml file, um, I don't know all the keys like that I can just name. So I just copy from an old one, or I Google it real quick. But for the exam, you don't really have that option. So you'll want to make sure that you really do know what those keys are, or know what different classes are, and they can't trick you by you know just using a random class and be like, yeah, every controller has to extend something, but what does it extend? Uh, I had to decide what sections I wanted to focus on. As a backend developer, the backend section of the exam was a lot easier for me. So I really focused my efforts on the front end. And at the end of the exam, they actually go through and they tell you how you scored on each section. And even though I focused on the front end, that was still my weakest section. So again, you may want to just kind of get an idea of your strengths and weaknesses and use that to help tailor your study regimen. Again, well, I took the exam online. Actually, I took it from the library at my house, but taking it online was super easy. I recommend doing that. It's nice not having to go to some place, be in a different or a situation that you can't kind of plan out ahead of time. Like I knew the room that I was going to be in, I had it booked, like I'm familiar with it. So I like being in my own element, getting to take it on my own terms. That made it a lot less stressful for me. But you can decide how you want to do it, and whichever works best for you. So as I said, there are parts to the certification. There are 4 parts. Here you can see them. They're roughly by the percentages of the exam that they represent. I'll go through each percentage as I go through each part. And in each part, I'll try to give you an idea of what might come up, or like what you should study, because just front-end development is, very broad and ambiguous term. So like specifically, what should I be looking at? What they might ask me. So fundamentals of web development is 10% of the exam. And this is just going to be basic web development. They're going to ask you basic HTML and CSS. If you're like me and you don't use CSS, maybe you want to go through and do a refresher. You probably know CSS, but you don't, you still Google things, and you don't know all the keywords offhand. So it might be to just have a refresher. And then HTML, they're going to ask you about basic tags. So as long as you know those, you'll be okay with that. They'll also ask you about JavaScript and jQuery. They'll ask basic questions about how to use JavaScript, but they are going to ask how to use it specifically with Drupal. So know how to add a JS library to a module, the different ways that you can do that. And generally, you can just Google, and it's pretty easy to find the different ways to do it, but you just want to make sure that you can identify them without using Google when you're on the exam. And then with Drupal, you have to use jQuery in a specific way. So just make sure that you do a little bit of research in that and make sure you know how to do that. They'll also ask you a few questions about Git as an SEM. If you use Git just generally in your development cycle or you use it for development, you'll probably get all these questions without any issue, especially if you're using something like Git flow. You'll be familiar with all the commands needed. If you don't use Git, then you might want to just do a quick tutorial of how to use Git, and that will probably cover everything that you need to know. The next section is front-end development, and that counts for about 25% of the exam. For the front-end development, you'll want to know how to create a new Drupal theme. And here you'll want to know how to actually create it, so not just copy it from an old project that you've done or copy something from GitHub. And they'll ask you a lot about the YAML files for things like themes and modules. So make sure to study the different keys and just the bare bones of what you need to have that YAML file. Because, for example, for a theme YAML file, they might ask you, what are the different keys needed? And then they might give you the option of like description or meta. And do you know which one it is based off of, just off the top of your head, or do you need to Google that? That's something that kind of got me is like, yeah, like I know how to create a YAML file for a theme, but like, can I just create it off of memory? Generally not. So I recommend going through and just kind of putting those into memory so that way you can have them for the exam. And that'll be the case for a lot of different YAML files, and I'll go through all of those throughout this presentation. Also, Drupal has great documentation for just theming in general. If you go to that link at the very bottom, Theming Drupal, there'll be sections that you can go through. And if you just go through each of those sections and for the things you do know, make sure you know all the specific keywords. And then the things that you don't know, really try to go through them and study them. That'll really help you for the front end part of the exam. And for the back end, there's a similar link, but the back end, going through the documentation helps tremendously. I can't stress that enough. Really just go through it, link section by section, go through all of it. That'll pretty much get you the bulk of the exam. So you'll want to know basic theming concepts, and this will all be in that documentation, but you'll need to know things like regions. You'll need to know how to use Twig templates, template pre-processing. So those magic functions that Drupal has, make sure you actually know the specific naming convention to do different things, and you're not just relying on Google, because I know I do. Like if I'm trying to do like some sort of form alter or just some sort of alter, I Google it a bunch of times real quick, and you can't do that on the exam, unfortunately. So make sure you just really study the specific naming conventions and go through that documentation section by section. Again, that will help you so much with this. There'll be a lot of questions on Twig in the front end section. If you've used Twig a bunch, you'll probably know most of this. Basic control structures like if statements, loops, knowing filtering, like use variables, print variables, essentially how to create a Twig file. If you've used Drupal in work, you've probably done this time and time again. And you'll also want to know how to, for example, override default Twig templates. This is another thing where it kind of got me, because I know how to do it. I look at the other Twig templates that I've overwritten and I just follow the same format. I know it's, dashes, but where are the double dashes? Sometimes like on the spot, I can't remember. And unfortunately, with the exam, you won't have other Twig templates to look at, to compare. You can't Google. So make sure you really know those naming conventions. That's going to help you a lot. And that's going to be a theme that's consistent throughout. Really make sure you know naming conventions and where they go, because that'll come out up a lot throughout the exam. So the next section is site building, and that's going to be about 30% of the exam. The core concepts here, you're going to want to know how to create content types and field types. You'll want to know how to create views, how to configure them, how to create filters. You'll want to be able to create and configure blocks. You'll want to know about block layouts, taxonomy, and vocabularies. It's going to be, pretty much everything that you do probably in the course of setting up, a site that uses a lot of Drupal's functionality. They're just going to ask you about it. So, there are some parts where you just haven't really used in the course of using Drupal. You may want to go in there, click around, know how to do it. A lot of this I really knew just through the course of work, because I have to create content types pretty much every time I stand up a site. So I'm pretty familiar with them. I've used views a bunch. That made that pretty easy. Just kind of knowing the different settings, different display modes, stuff like that. So, if you haven't used views much, you may want to play around with it, because I find that using something really helps you learn it better than just reading the documentation. But you also want to make sure you're reading the documentation so you are doing the best practice way to do it, and you're not just kind of finding a workaround in the GUI. You'll want to make sure you also know the configuration management and building navigation menus. Again, stuff that if you built a site, you probably already know, but it doesn't hurt to kind of do a refresher and make sure the specific way to get to it in the dropdown, because they will ask you, how would you do this? Where would you go? Stuff like that. So for content types, you'll want to make sure you know what a content entity is. You want to know what's the difference between it and like a configuration entity. They will kind of probe, a little more specific on content types, because they're so integral to Drupal. You want to be familiar with the different fields and settings. So, going over this when studying can be as simple as just looking at all the fields that Drupal has, making sure that you've set some of them up before, the different settings that they can have. If you've set up many Drupal sites, you probably know this, but it doesn't hurt to go back and know that you know specifically all the different settings. And they'll also ask you like some questions about site building, like how to create data structures, how to relate entities, so like how to create tags or something like that. If you're setting up a blog or just any sort of CMS, like what are the types of things that you would need to do? They'll ask you questions that kind of probe at, do you know how to do those things? So I would just make sure you really know how to relate entities, how to set up content content types, and just in general go through the admin menu, because they're going to just ask general questions about site building too, like how do you turn on caching, how do you clear caching, where would you change the site name, do you know that off the top of your head, or do you just generally kind of look at the menu bar and figure it out? That's generally what I do. I can't tell you just off the top of my head, because I'm so used to, like, it's so quick to figure out, why store that in my head. But for the exam, you need to know those things. All right, so the last part of the exam is backend development. That's the biggest section. It's 35%. Lucky for me, this is where I'm really most familiar. So that did help me, but there is a lot that you have to go over for this. And there are even like some things that I just hadn't come across that I learned when studying for the exam. So you'll want to make sure you really know all the different core APIs. The link at the bottom will tell you through all the different APIs, and you can go through them and find the documentation for each. You'll really want to know PHP object-oriented programming. So just general object-oriented programming, like the concepts of polymorphism, why would you use it? Why would you use abstraction? But also PHP's keywords for implementing object-oriented or polymorphism. So like know what an abstract class is, know what an interface is, know the difference between the two, why you might use those. So if you are not familiar with object-oriented programming, maybe do a refresh or do a course on it. If you want, you could do a refresher just to make sure that you're familiar with them and you have them all in your head. You'll need to know how to do basic CRUD, create, read, update, delete. So how do you create an entity? How do you update it? How do you get data from an entity? So if you load a node and it has a field in it, do you know how to get the value from that field? And if they give you a multiple select and you don't have Google, do you really know what methods to use? You need to make sure that you know that without having to use Google. Coding standards, they're going to ask about coding standards a little, and just remember that as far as code formatting, it's not PSR. Drupal has its own coding standard. So if you're not using that, at least make sure you're familiar with it. They'll ask you about performance. So you make sure you know how to use Drupal's caching. They'll go over security a bit, and that's going to be the main things that you think about when you think about security, like user input sanitation. They're going to ask you about sanitizing variables that you're going to put into MySQL queries, so that way you can't have a MySQL injection. So make sure you're familiar with using Drupal's database layer. Make sure you're familiar with how to validate user input and how to sanitize input for security. And if you don't know that already, that's something you should definitely learn, and everybody should know and should always be using, because it just makes everybody's world a little bit better of a place. They're also going to ask a few questions about unit testing. I know a lot of people don't use unit testing. I don't use it as much as I should. So this was something that I still had to do a refresher for, go through maybe just a quick tutorial on unit testing and PHP in general, look at some of the unit tests that Drupal has, and things that you don't know, Google and see what they are and the reasons that they're used. Make sure you know the basics of PHP unit testing, and that'll help you a lot to get through those questions. Like I said, I don't use it, so it was something that I definitely had to look at more for the exam than a lot of the other things that I use on a regular basis. And I can't stress enough, for both the front end and the back end, going through the Drupal documentation, there's a lot of it, but if you go through every section and you really learn it, that's just the best thing that you can do for this exam. It really helps you. And just remember when you're learning it that you really know the specific names, the naming conventions, that you're not just copy and pasting, because on the exam, you can't copy and paste. I can look at something in the documentation and it can make sense to me, and then I walk away and 5 minutes later and you're like, what class did it extend? It's just out of my mind. I have no idea, because I know I can Google it. So make sure you really know the specifics of what classes you have to extend, what are the naming conventions, things like that. There's also going to be some questions about, for example, services and dependency injection. So make sure you understand dependency injection, how to inject services. The services.yaml file is another one that you should study. So if you're injecting a service, how do you pass arguments to that service? Stuff like that. If you don't use services a bunch in your own project, you can always go into Google, or I'm sorry, not Google, Drupal core, and you can look for the service.yaml files in there, see the different things that they use, figure out the reasons that they use them. Generally, a quick Google will give you the answer to that, and make sure you know the specific syntax to do that, because it will be asked on the exam. Some other YAML files that you're going to be asked about, the .info.yaml. So if you're creating a new module, a lot of people nowadays, you have code generators. You use something that just like generates a new module for you. And when was the last time someone actually, from memory created a new YAML file for a module? Maybe that y'all are much better than I am at this, but generally I copy and paste, or I use a code generation tool. So it's not always fresh in my memory, the specific things, like the name. Like I know that it needs a name, but what is the key word from there? If you really asked me, and you gave me some clever, tricky alternatives, would I be able to get it? Maybe not now, but I studied for it, and when I took the exam, I knew. You'll also need to know the routing.yaml file, how to create, routes, how to create routes with the arguments in it, what's the syntax for that, how to create named routes, things like this. If you're using the routing.yaml file a lot, you probably know about a bunch about this, but you still might want to do a refresher to make sure you can bring it off the top of your head. If you aren't a backend developer, these are two, or all three of these YAML files are ones that you should really go into. They'll ask also questions about basic backend things that you might do, like create controllers. How would you create it? What would it look like? They might show you some code segments, and make sure that like what any classes that will need to be extended, or stuff like that. Annotations. There were a few questions that I got about annotations. I think they were about blocks. So make sure you go through and know how Drupal uses annotations. Know how to use entities in the backend. So especially like CRUD. How would you get some vocabulary that a entity has? Can you identify that from a multiple choice right now? Or is that something that you would need to Google? And forms, if you wanted to create a form, how would you do it? A lot of us probably already know how. Do you really know are you confident enough in what class gets extended that you can pick it out of a, for multiple choice? For that one, it's pretty easy, but still, it makes you feel a lot safer when you just check it beforehand and you really know everything about how to create a form or how to create a controller. And when researching this, you might find something that you didn't know before, which is just kind of a helpful part of studying for the exam. They'll also go over best practices, so object-oriented programming concepts. Make sure you know object-oriented programming concepts. They might ask you some just kind of high-level theoretical questions, and they'll also ask you some PHP-specific questions. Again, coding standards and sanitizing input. So that's where they really get you for security. So make sure you know how to do that. It doesn't hurt to Google, Drupal security best practices and just go over what's provided and keep that in your mind because it'll help you in future projects. It might be something that's included in the exam. And it's just a good thing to know because security really is something that transfers just not from PHP to full stack development, but pretty much any sort of development that you're going to do in your career. So, and the same for object-oriented programming. You know, a lot of it is specific to Drupal and the reasons that they're asking for it. But so many of these comments or concepts really do just transfer among so many different fields that you can go, or technologies that you can use in development, not even in PHP. So like if you wanted to do Java or Ruby or anything else, these concepts help you out. So make sure you really know them, and it'll help you in your career and it'll make it super easy on the exam. Okay, so sorry if I flew through that a little too quickly. I will go through I'll do a Q&A at the end or after this. I just want to wrap up with a few things. I want to remind you to make sure you really do study those YAML files. That really got me, so don't let it get you. You know, I know what they are. I know how to use them. I just forgot, you know, is it this keyword or is it that keyword? I know that that keyword's supposed to go there, but what is the name of it? So don't let that get you. Make sure you go through those documentation that I provided. So for example, this one at the very bottom link, go through that, each section. That's going to help you so much. And for the front end down there, go through that. It's going to take you through Twig. It's going to take you through creating a theme. It's going to take you through everything that you need to know to really pass this exam. And just I went ahead and added a resources slide to this. So hopefully I can make this publicly available so everybody can get these links if they don't have them already. I'll also try to paste them in chat in case you can't get the slide, because I know that the slides did go by pretty quick, so maybe you weren't able to type them down. But again, really go through the Drupal documentation. It's such a great resource. You're going to learn things that you didn't know about Drupal, which is great because it helps improve you as a developer. It helps improve what you can provide your clients, and it's really going to help you on this exam.
Okay, great, Joe. Thanks so much. Just want to mention that the video for this is going to be posted on YouTube. I think we actually have a link for the video. I'll see if I can get that, and we'll post it in the chat when the session's over. So there are a couple of questions if you're ready.
Yeah, I'm looking through right now. Eric asked if all the questions are multiple choice or fill-in questions. They all were multiple choice, or at least they were all, there were some where it was like select all that apply, stuff like that, but they were all questions that didn't need to be hand graded because you get an instant response. So I think that pretty much made it to where it was all multiple choice or multiple select. There were no manual inputs that I recall. Janice?
So some of the other questions are, what kind of tricky questions do you find during the test?
Definitely one's trying to get you with the naming convention. So if you're like replacing or you're overwriting a Twig template file, you know, they'll give you one with 1 dash, one with 2 dashes. They'll try to make sure that you actually know the naming convention. For like, they'll give you a bare bones like module YAML file, and they'll say, you know, what are the keys that are needed, what are the minimum ones that are needed, stuff like that, and you need to know that, and they'll definitely give you ones that you think, yeah, that could have been there, and maybe I just don't remember it. Yeah, if that made sense. Sorry.
Okay, there's someone asking what the cost is.
Well, I do not recall the cost. Luckily, my company paid for the exam for me. I want to say it was between 1 and 300 to
Okay,
some of
everyone's
the
saying
specific.
250.
Okay.
Yeah, we're encouraging our developers as well to take this exam, and fortunately, our company is also able to cover that, which is really fortunate. Okay, some of the other questions. Let's see. Besides Drupal.org documentation, did you use other resources for preparing for the exam?
Um, s Definitely, my main thing was Drupal.org documentation. Other than that, looking through core or projects that I'd already made, just to look at like the services.yaml file. So I went through a bunch of different services.yaml files in the core to make sure that there wasn't some special things that you could do in it that I didn't know about. Maybe that Drupal core was using. So I went through just a bunch of like modules that I thought were good to look at, that I was either glad that I made or that were core modules. So I knew that they were all best practice, and tried to see how they were. And if there was something that I didn't know, I would research it and find out. That unfortunately there wasn't like a practice test or anything that I could just go through. So that was mainly how I studied.
Asking if you fail, can you try again for free?
I do not recall.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I know some other exams have like that you can pay a little more and do that, like Security Plus lets you do that. I'm not sure about this exam. Yeah.
Let's see. How much did you find the exam to be useful for your daily work versus things like more like career advancement?
So I think the exam would probably be just having the certification is probably more helpful with something like career development, but studying for the exam helped, really did help me in some of my daily work. So kind of, two sides of the same coin.
Makes a lot of sense. Michael's asking, can you cover all the testing environment requirements?
Um, I forget the company that did it. I have a MacBook Pro. That worked. You're not allowed to talk during the exam. If you're talking about like the online exam, you're not allowed to talk during the exam. You have to have your microphone on so they can make sure no one's talking to you. So mainly it's a quiet place without lots of paper or anything that could be construed as cheating or even um, you know perceived about it in any way. Yeah. As far as if you're asking like, can I do it on a Linux box or a Windows box? I'm not sure about that.
So I have a question. Since you've taken this one, do you feel persuaded to take any of the other exams?
I have thought about taking the backend development exam. I've just been extremely busy, so I haven't been able to get around to it. But there is a backend, there's a front end, and a site building. And I believe if you get all of them, you can be what's called a grandmaster. And
I think there's actually a competition to rename that to something else.
oh, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, but right now, yeah, it's called Grandmaster. I guess do you get to wear like a cape and carry a staff too?
Mhm. Oh, I didn't know about that. But I'm sure maybe it'll be like a pro or something. You could look into that. That might be a goal that some people set for themselves. Um, I don't know how. I would have to really study for a front end one myself. So in order to get that, and I did read that you have to have it's. I specifically took the Drupal 9 certification. Um, and if you want to get the main one, or like the one that combines them all, they all have to be from the same version. So you can't do like a front end 7, back end 8, site builder 9. Yeah.
Really good to know. Yeah, I was going to ask if they did have any kind of spillover into other versions, even though you may have taken like a Drupal 8 certification. Were there other questions that may have been possibly for Drupal 9? I know there's a lot in common there, but I didn't know if there was anything in particular.
I took actually the certification for Drupal 9. And I pretty much exclusively work with Drupal 8. I didn't really notice. I don't remember anything that threw me off because it was Drupal 9 versus Drupal 8. That could
Yeah,
be,
probably wouldn't be too much.
yeah. What I wouldn't know because I've never used Drupal 7. I imagine they could do something like throw in a Drupal 7 way to do it that's deprecated or you're not allowed to do anymore is the way to try to trick you. But it wouldn't have tricked me because I've never used Drupal 7, so don't even know.
Um, Someone's asking about a practice test, and I think someone in the chat posted a GitHub link to a practice study guide, but I don't know if there's any. I have also looked for a practice test, and I don't know that there is one. There used to be one that someone made several years back for Drupal 8, but it doesn't seem to work anymore.
Yeah, I could not find one. I really tried to do that because it's very satisfying to go through a practice test before the exam and be like, yeah, I passed the practice test. That takes a lot of stress off of me for the real exam. But I couldn't find one. There were some things out there, but I just they really weren't accurate. They didn't seem accurate when I looked at them, and after taking the exam, I don't really think that they helped.
Great. Any other questions? Last call. I think that might be it. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Joe. This is really good. I definitely would like for some of our developers to review this session. So thank you so much for giving it.
Thank everybody for coming.